I found my old bank card in a coat I hadn't worn in 15 years. When I called the bank, the manager said, "Your balance is $33 million. Do you know who has been depositing into this account all years?" Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The coat had been hanging in the back of my closet for 15 years, sandwiched between a winter parka I never wore anymore and a bridesmaid dress from my college friend Karen's wedding. I found it on a Saturday morning in late October when I was finally doing what I'd been putting off since the kids left for college, cleaning out the house room by room, making decisions about what stayed and what went to Goodwill. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 52 years old and I live in the same house in Evanston, Illinois, where I raised my 2 children, Tyler and Meg, mostly alone. I say mostly because my husband James was alive for the first years of their lives, present and laughing and entirely himself, right up until the Tuesday in November when he wasn't anymore. A drunk driver on Route 41, a pickup truck crossing the center line, and then nothing. Just a phone call from a stranger at 9:14 in the evening while I was helping Tyler with his second grade homework. That was 15 years ago. And in the time between then and that October morning, I had rebuilt my life in the way that widows do, carefully, stubbornly, one day at a time. I went back to work as an administrative coordinator at Northwestern University. I budgeted. I clipped coupons for a while before that embarrassed me too much to continue. I drove used cars and cooked at home and told myself it was enough, that James would have been proud of how I managed. What I never questioned, not seriously, not until that Saturday though, was the settlement from James's estate. His brother Richard had handled everything. Richard Calloway, the older brother, the one who wore expensive watches and called himself an entrepreneur, had been named executor of James's will. At the time, I had been too deep in grief to argue or examine anything closely. Richard had sat across from me at his mahogany dining table, with his wife Lynn positioned at his side like a decorative object, and he had explained, slowly, sympathetically, with the careful tone of a man delivering bad news he'd already processed, that James's company was struggling, that the debts outweighed the assets, that after everything was settled, there would be approximately $42,000 left for me. $42,000, and the house, which had a mortgage. I remember nodding. I remember thanking him. I was 37 years old, and I thanked the man for telling me I had almost nothing. Now, standing in my bedroom on that Saturday morning, I pulled the old black wool coat off its hanger. It was a good coat, cashmere blend, the kind James had insisted on buying me for our 10th anniversary, even though I'd told him it was too expensive. I pressed my face into the fabric for a moment. It still smelled, faintly, of something I couldn't name, a memory without an image. I slipped it on out of instinct, just to feel it, and that's when my hand found the inner pocket. There was something stiff inside it, a rectangle of hard plastic. I pulled it out and stood there looking at it under the bedroom light. It was a bank card, a plain gray card with no logo I recognized immediately, issued by something called Meridian Private Bank. The name on it was James A. Mitchell. The expiration date on the front read June 12th, which meant it had expired 10 years ago. I didn't know this bank. I had never heard James mention it. I set the coat on the bed and sat down beside it and turned the card over in my hands for a long time. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 10. Why had James kept a card in an inner coat pocket? Why this coat, which he'd given to me? Had he meant for me to find it? Or had it slipped in during some ordinary moment, a shared closet, a borrowed coat on a cold day, and simply been forgotten? I told myself it was nothing. A dead account with $30 in it, or nothing at all. I told myself I would call just to close the loop, the way you do with old utilities or forgotten gym memberships, just to cross it off the list. So I called. The number on the back of the card still worked. I went through the automated prompts. I gave James's social security number. I still had it memorized from years of tax filings, and his date of birth and the card number. There was a pause, and then a human voice came on the line. "Thank you for holding. This is Greg Ferris at Meridian Private Bank. How can I help you today?" I explained that I was the widow of the account holder, that I'd found the card among his belongings. A longer pause. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, and his voice had shifted. Careful now, precise. "Are you in a safe place to talk?" I almost laughed. "I'm sitting on my bed," I said. "Why?" "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly," he said. "The account associated with this card currently holds a balance of $33,412,000. I didn't say anything. "Mrs. Mitchell?" "I'm sorry," I said. "Can you repeat that?" He did, and the number was the same. $33 million. In an account with my dead husband's name on it. An account I had never heard of, in a bank I had never known existed. And the question that came through the phone, quiet, carefully professional, was one that would change the next year of my life completely. "Do you have any idea who has been making deposits into this account for the past 15 years? I sat on that bed for a very long time after I hung up. Greg Ferris had been careful with me. He'd explained that, as a surviving spouse, I likely had a legal claim to the account, but that the bank's protocol required documentation before they could discuss the account in detail, a death certificate, proof of marriage, proof of identity. He'd given me an email address and told me to reach out when I was ready. His voice had been professionally neutral the entire time, but I'd heard something underneath it, a kind of watchfulness, the tone of someone who had seen something unusual and was waiting to see how it unfolded. I wrote down the balance on a Post-it note because I needed to see it outside my own head. $33,412,000. I stuck it on my nightstand and stared at it until the numbers started to feel real. Then I started thinking. The question Greg had asked, who had been making deposits, landed differently the longer I sat with it. He hadn't said, was there activity on the account? He'd said deposits, plural, ongoing. Someone had been putting money into James's private account for 15 years, after James was dead, which meant someone with access to the account, someone who knew the account existed, had continued to fund it. I thought about Richard. I had always felt in a vague and guilt-tinged way that something about James's estate settlement had been too quick, too neat, too heavily summarized. But grief does something to your critical thinking. It fills the space where questions might grow. I'd been too exhausted and too broken to push back, and Richard had presented himself as a grieving brother doing his duty, and I had accepted that. But James had built a real company. Callaway Mitchell Consulting had 15 employees and solid contracts with 3 regional hospital systems when he died. I remembered that. I remembered the office Christmas party the year before the accident, how James had talked about expanding into Chicago proper. The company had not been failing. I would have known, unless I'd been told it was. The thought arrived not with anger, but with a specific, nauseating clarity, the kind that comes when you realize you've been looking at a pattern for years without seeing what it meant. Richard had liquidated the company within 8 months of James's death. He told me there was nothing left, But what if the company had been worth significantly more, and someone had redirected those assets before I could ask questions? What if the account at Meridian was where that money had been going, and who had kept it running since then? I stood up and went to the kitchen and made coffee I didn't drink, standing at the counter while the machine ran, watching the dark liquid fill the pot. Outside, my neighbor's dog was barking at something. It was a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning in Evanston, and I was standing in my kitchen understanding for the first time that I might have been defrauded out of a fortune while I clipped grocery coupons and told myself I was managing. The fear came then. Real fear, not the ambient anxiety of ordinary life, but something sharper. The fear of what it meant to know this, of who would have to answer for it, of what Richard was capable of if he understood that I was asking questions. Because here is what I knew about Richard Calloway after 23 years of watching him from close range. He was meticulous. He was controlling. He had a lawyer on retainer for his business dealings, and he played golf with 2 sitting county judges. He was not a man who made sloppy mistakes, and he was not a man who accepted challenges to his position without fighting back. But he had made one mistake, one small physical textile mistake. He had not checked the pockets of the coat he'd given to his brother. Or, and this thought made me grip the counter, had James hidden the card there for a reason? Had James known near the end that something was wrong? Had this been an accident or a message in a pocket? I couldn't answer that, not yet. What I could do was plan. I am not by nature an impulsive person. I'm the woman who cross-references 3 reviews before buying a kitchen appliance. I'm the woman who had a college savings account for Tyler before he could walk. Whatever I did next, I would not do it in a panic, and I would not do it alone. First, documentation. I needed everything I could find about James's company, his estate, the original settlement. I had boxes in the basement, 15 years of organized files because I am that kind of woman. Those boxes suddenly felt like something more than sentiment. Second, legal counsel. Not a general family lawyer, a probate attorney, someone who specialized in estate disputes, fraud, financial recovery. Third, silence. Not a word to anyone in the family, not a word to Richard, not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with and had someone in my corner. I took the Post-it off my nightstand and folded it into my wallet. Then I went down to the basement and started pulling boxes. I worked until midnight, and by the time I came back upstairs, my eyes burning under the fluorescent light, I had found 3 things: the original estate settlement agreement bearing Richard's signature, a company valuation report from the year before James died, listing Callaway Mitchell Consulting at a value of $4.2 million, and a handwritten note in James's handwriting on the back of a utility envelope that said only, "Meridian Tiao, ask Richard." My hands were shaking, but my mind was very, very clear. I found Mark Weston through the university's legal referral service on Monday morning, calling from my office with my door closed and my voice low. His firm specialized in probate litigation and estate fraud. His assistant scheduled me for Thursday. I spent those 3 days rereading every document I'd pulled from the basement and typing everything I knew into a single organized file on my personal laptop, never my work computer. Mark Weston turned out to be a slight, precise man in his mid-50s with a habit of writing everything down in a narrow yellow legal pad while he listened. His office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Chicago, with a view of Lake Michigan that I appreciated in a distant way, the way you appreciate weather you're not actually standing in. I sat across from him and laid everything out: the coat, the card, the phone call, the balance, the note in James's handwriting, the valuation report, the settlement agreement. He was quiet for a while after I finished. "The handwritten note is significant," he said. "If it's authenticated as James's handwriting, and it can be, it indicates he knew about the Meridian account and associated it with Richard, which suggests Richard was involved with the account during James's lifetime." Involved how? That's what we need to establish. At minimum, Richard had knowledge of the account. At maximum, he paused, he had signatory access and has been managing it since James's death without disclosure to you as a surviving spouse. Is that fraud? Depending on the structure of the account and the estate terms, it could be fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and concealment of marital assets. Any one of those is serious. All three together. He let that sit without finishing it, which I found more effective than any words he might have added. He recommended a financial investigator named Ruth Beckett, whom his firm used regularly. He made the introduction the same afternoon. Ruth was a former forensic accountant for the IRS, compact and direct, with a talent for making complicated financial structures sound inevitable in hindsight. She took the account information and the company valuation and told me she'd have preliminary findings within 2 weeks. What I didn't expect was how quickly Richard would sense something shifting. I hadn't called him. I hadn't mentioned anything to anyone. But Richard had a particular sensitivity to disruption in his orbit. James had mentioned it once, that his brother could smell a power shift the way animals smell weather. 11 days after my appointment with Mark, my phone rang and it was Richard. "Sarah." His voice was warm, the warmth of someone practicing warmth. "I've been thinking about you. Lynn and I were talking. We haven't had you over in months. You should come for dinner." I sat very still. "That's kind of you," I said. "It's not kindness, it's family," he said. The word family in his mouth always had a particular weight, like a hand pressing gently on a shoulder. I told him I'd check my schedule. I did not commit to anything. After I hung up, I sat for a long time. The call meant nothing, possibly, or it meant he had some kind of alert or contact at Meridian. Unlikely, but not impossible. Or it meant that someone else had noticed my request for documents through the estate court and word had filtered back. Or it was entirely coincidental. I didn't believe in coincidences where Richard was concerned. I called Mark and told him about the call. He said to stay quiet and let Ruth work. Ruth delivered her first report 17 days after our initial meeting. I read it sitting at my kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink. She had traced the deposit history on the Meridian account through the bank's cooperation. Since I was now formally identified as a surviving spouse with legal representation, the bank had become more communicative. The account had been opened jointly by James and Richard Calloway Mitchell 14 months before James died. For the first 8 months after James's death, there had been no activity. Then, beginning in month 9, regular quarterly deposits had resumed. Each deposit was between $180,000 and $240,000. They came from an LLC called CMC Holdings, registered in Delaware. CMC Holdings, Calloway Mitchell Consulting, collapsed to initials, moved into a shell company. Richard had not liquidated the company. He had restructured it, rebranded it, and continued operating it under a different name, while telling me there was nothing left. For 15 years, he had deposited the profits into a joint account that he apparently intended no one would ever find. I closed the folder. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Ordinary Evanston, October leaves in the gutters, a man walking a retriever past my neighbor's driveway. Everything looked the same. Everything was completely different. Was it possible that James had never known? Or had he opened the account together with Richard as a long-term plan, a private fund, and simply never told me? I found I could live with that question for now. Whatever James's intentions had been, he was gone. Richard was here, and Richard had taken something that was not his to take. I had my proof. Now I needed to decide what to do with it. The plan, in its final form, had 3 parts. Part 1 was filing a formal petition in Cook County Probate Court to reopen James's estate on the grounds of fraudulent concealment of marital assets. Mark handled this. It was filed on a gray Tuesday morning, quietly and correctly, with the supporting documentation Ruth had compiled. Part 2 was a formal complaint to the Illinois Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division, referencing CMC Holdings and the diversion of business assets. Part 3 was a civil suit against Richard Calloway personally for breach of fiduciary duty as executor of James's estate. Mark had counseled patience, but he had also been clear. The longer we waited, the more time Richard had to move assets. So we moved on all 3 fronts simultaneously, within the same week. I knew it wouldn't stay quiet. Legal filings leave tracks. People talk. I expected Richard to find out within days. He found out in 4. His first call came on a Friday evening. I let it go to voicemail. His voice on the message was controlled but tightly so, like a man speaking through clenched teeth. "Sarah, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. These are very serious accusations, and I'd really like to sit down and talk before this goes any further. Call me back." I didn't. The second call came the following Monday. This time, it was from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was a man identifying himself as Douglas Farr, Richard's attorney. "Mrs. Mitchell," Douglas Farr said, "I want to be direct with you. My client is deeply concerned about these filings and what they represent. He believes there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of the accounts in question, and he's prepared to explain everything if given the opportunity. He would like to propose a mediated meeting before this proceeds further." "I have my own attorney," I said. "Please contact him." "Of course. But I want to make sure you understand." And here his voice shifted, dropped into something that wasn't quite a threat, but was the thing just before a threat. These proceedings could become very public, very complicated, and very costly for everyone involved, including you. I noticed my heart had sped up. I noticed it, and I let it. "I understand," I said. "Please call Mark Weston's office." I hung up. I stood in my living room and breathed slowly for a minute. Then I called Diana Hughes, my best friend since graduate school, who was the only person outside of my legal team who knew what was happening. "They called," I told her. "Of course they did," she said. "How are you?" "Scared," I said, "but I know what I'm doing." 3 days later, I came home from work to find Richard's car parked outside my house. He was sitting in it. When he saw my headlights, he got out. I sat in my car for 10 seconds, deciding. Then I got out too. He looked older than I remembered from our last encounter at a family Christmas 2 years ago. The silver at his temples had spread. He was wearing a very good coat. "Sarah." He spread his hands, a gesture of openness. "I just want to talk." "You should call my attorney," I said, and moved toward my door. He stepped in front of me. Not aggressively, precisely. Placing himself in my path with the deliberateness of a man who understood physical space as a negotiating tool. "I want you to understand what you're doing," he said. "James and I built that company together. I kept it alive after he died. Everything I've done has been to protect what was left of his legacy." I looked at him for a long moment. By not telling me it existed. The estate was complicated. Then why didn't you say so? I asked. Why didn't you mention CMC Holdings? Why didn't you tell me there was an account at Meridian Private Bank with my husband's name on it? He said nothing. For a fraction of a second, one very revealing fraction, his expression collapsed slightly before he rebuilt it. "Step aside, Richard," I said. He stepped aside. I went inside and locked the door and leaned against it in the hallway and let myself shake for 2 full minutes. Then I called Mark, reported the encounter, and sent him the dates and times. He advised me to document everything and said that showing up at my home like that was not going to help Richard's position in court. The following week, I took 4 days off from work. I drove to a small rental cabin near Lake Geneva in Wisconsin that Deanna recommended. No one knew where I was except her. I walked along the lake in the mornings. I slept 9 hours a night. I made soup on a small gas stove and read a novel I'd been meaning to read for 3 years. And I let my body understand that I was not breaking, that I was only gathering myself for what came next. When I came back from Lake Geneva, there was an envelope waiting for me at my house, hand-delivered, no postage. Inside was a single page on Callaway and Associates letterhead and a check made out to me for $500,000. The letter, unsigned but clearly composed by Douglas Farr, framed this as a good faith gesture of restitution from Richard, made without admission of wrongdoing, contingent on my agreement to withdraw all filings and sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement. $500,000. 15 years ago, I would have cried at the sight of that number. I photographed the envelope, the letter, and the check. I sent the photos to Mark. Then I placed everything back in the envelope and set it on my kitchen counter with the same calm I'd feel looking at any piece of junk mail. What exactly was a $500,000 bribe meant to accomplish against $33 million? Did Richard think I hadn't done the arithmetic? Or did he believe I was still the woman he'd sat across from at his mahogany table in November of another lifetime, the woman who nodded and said thank you? I was not that woman anymore. Mark told me that the check and letter were extraordinarily useful. An unsolicited payment accompanied by a request to sign an NDA and withdraw legal filings was, in the context of our existing case, essentially an acknowledgement of liability dressed in careful language. He was adding it to the file. I went back to work. What I hadn't anticipated was how much I needed other people during this stretch, not as co-conspirators or advisors, but simply as witnesses to the fact that I was still a person living a life, not just a litigant. Deanna was a constant. She called every 2 or 3 days, and I let her talk about ordinary things. Her garden, her son's soccer team, the renovation she was doing to her kitchen. And I let that ordinariness wash over me like cool water. But I also needed more than one set of eyes, and I was careful about who I brought into the circle. I told my daughter Meg on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on her porch in Lincoln Park. She was 26, working as a pediatric nurse, and she had her father's quality of going very still when she was processing something serious. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment. "Mom," she said, "you've been handling this alone for how long?" 2 months. She shook her head slowly, not in disappointment, but in the particular admiration that sometimes moves between a parent and an adult child when they see each other clearly for the first time. "What do you need from me?" she asked. That question, that simple, exact question. I felt something release in my chest, the tightly held breath of a woman who had spent 15 years believing that needing something was a kind of weakness. "Just this," I said, "just knowing you know." "Tyler." I told the following week over the phone because he was in Seattle. He was quieter than Meg. his reaction more internal, but his first words after I finished were, "That man sat at Dad's funeral. He gave a eulogy." Yes, he had. Richard had stood at the podium in the chapel and talked about James's integrity, about what it meant to be a man of his word. The memory had a different quality now. I also reached out, carefully and with Mark's approval, to two of James's former employees, people who had been with Callaway Mitchell Consulting in the final years. One of them, a project manager named Gloria Chen, had been working for CMC Holdings when it was quietly restructured under Richard. She had assumed it was a routine business continuity move, a reorganization after the founder's death. She hadn't known about the Meridian account. She hadn't known about the settlement Richard had given me. She agreed to give a voluntary statement. I was no longer alone, and the circle, while small, was made of people who would not bend. Lynn called on a Thursday in December. Not Richard, Lynn, which was, in itself, a tactical decision. Lynn had always been the softer instrument in that partnership, deployed when a blunter approach had failed. She had a voice that implied intimacy without earning it, warm and slightly tired, like a woman who had been carrying something heavy out of love for people who didn't deserve it. "Sarah," she said, "can we get lunch? Just us. No lawyers, no drama. I feel like so much has been lost and I miss you, and I think Richard does too, even if he doesn't know how to say it." I was standing in my kitchen. The afternoon light was coming in at a long angle, the way it does in December, cutting across the floor in one thin band. "What would we talk about?" I asked. "Everything," she said. "The kids. James. How things got so complicated. Sarah, I want you to understand that Richard never intended Lynn." I said it very quietly. "I know what this is." A pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm not going to withdraw the filings. I mean that the offer in the envelope was returned to your attorney. I mean that I appreciate you calling, and I know that what you're doing right now is genuinely difficult for you, but it won't change anything." Another pause, longer. When she spoke again, the warmth had a slightly different quality, still present but with something harder underneath it, like a floor beneath carpet. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said. "Do you understand how long these things take? The legal costs alone. Mark Weston doesn't work for free, Sarah. You could spend 3 years in court and come out with nothing. I'll take that risk. James wouldn't have wanted this." I felt that one. I want to be honest about that. There is nothing quite like being told what your dead husband would have wanted by the people who robbed his estate. I felt it the way you feel a cold surface, sharp, immediate, clarifying. "James," I said slowly, "left me a card in a coat pocket. I think James would have wanted exactly this." Silence. "I'll see you in court," I said, and ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter and stood there. My hands were steady. My pulse was elevated, but not alarmingly so. I felt a specific kind of fear. Not the fear that I was wrong or that I might lose, but the fear of real opposition from people with resources and motivation. Richard was not going to stop. He would escalate. What surprised me was what the fear did to me. It didn't weaken my resolve. It hardened it. Because fear that you can name is a different animal than fear that you can't, and now I could name exactly what I was afraid of, and I knew exactly why I was doing this anyway. 2 weeks later, Richard and Lynn showed up at my door together. It was a Saturday morning. I saw their car from the upstairs window before they rang the bell. I had time to call Mark quickly and put my phone in my cardigan pocket with the record function running, which Mark had advised me was legal in Illinois as long as I was a party to the conversation. I opened the door. Richard was wearing the expression of a man who had decided to be reasonable. It sat on him with visible effort. Lynn stood slightly behind him, arranged in concern. "We want to talk," Richard said. 5 minutes. No lawyers. "My attorney is aware you're here," I said. "What do you want to say?" He inhaled. "I want you to understand that this will destroy the family. Whatever you think happened, whatever you've been told, this litigation will tear apart everything James built. His name will be in court documents. His company will be picked apart in public. Is that what you want for his legacy?" "James's legacy," I said, "is my son and my daughter. That's all the legacy I need." Lynn stepped forward. "Sarah, please. We're not your enemies. We're trying to protect you from a process that will hurt you more than it hurts us. We have more resources. We have more time. We can do this for years." "Then we will," I said. "For years, if that's what it takes." Richard's composure slipped. Only slightly, but I saw it. A tightening around his eyes, a muscle working in his jaw. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. The warmth was gone from his voice. What was underneath it was cold and flat. "I have a very good idea," I said. "Goodbye, Richard." I closed the door. I stood in the hallway and listened to their car pull away. Then I stopped the recording and sent the audio file to Mark. My heart was going fast, but I was smiling. The deposition took place in February, on a morning when Chicago was living up to everything people say about it in winter. A flat, gray, absolute cold pressing against the windows of the conference room where we all assembled. Mark had been building toward this for 5 months. Ruth Beckett had produced a forensic accounting report that now ran to 217 pages. It traced every deposit into the Meridian account, every quarterly payment from CMC Holdings, every tax filing made by the shell company. And it established, with the patience of mathematics, that Richard Callaway had received and redirected approximately $19 million in business proceeds that should have been disclosed as estate assets and distributed, at minimum partially, to me as James's surviving spouse. The other $14 million was the original principal that James and Richard had deposited together before James's death. Money that James had apparently been setting aside as a private fund, the purpose of which had not been documented. This portion was more legally complicated, and Mark was honest with me about that. But the $19 million was clean. It was conversion of assets. It was, in the plainest terms, theft from a widow. Richard entered the deposition with Douglas Farr and a second attorney, whose presence suggested they had finally understood the scale of what was happening. He was composed. He was dressed carefully. He looked like a man who had rehearsed. I sat across the table from him and watched Douglas Farr object to 3 of Mark's first 6 questions. Richard answered the ones that got through in measured complete sentences, acknowledging the existence of CMC Holdings, acknowledging the existence of the Meridian account, framing everything within a narrative in which he had acted entirely in good faith as executor, maintaining the company's operation to preserve its value for eventual distribution. I had prepared myself for this moment for months, the moment of sitting 3 feet away from the man who had looked me in the eye at James's funeral and spoken about integrity. I had rehearsed my own stillness, and yet nothing quite prepares you for the reality of it. The fluorescent light, the paper cups of water no one touched, the court reporter's fingers moving with quiet indifference over her machine. Reality has a texture that imagination cannot replicate. I sat with my hands folded on the table, and I breathed. "Eventual distribution," Mark repeated, writing it down. "Can you tell me when this distribution was planned to occur?" "It was an ongoing process," Richard said. Over 15 years. Business doesn't operate on a fixed schedule. Did you inform Mrs. Mitchell of the existence of the Meridian account at any point during the past 15 years? A pause. The matter was pending review. That's not what I asked, Mark said pleasantly. Did you inform her? Yes or no? I exercised my judgment as executor. Mr. Calloway. Mark opened his folder and placed a single document on the table, the handwritten note in James's handwriting. This note, forensically authenticated, reads, Meridian, ask Richard. It was found among James Mitchell's personal effects. It suggests that James associated the Meridian account with you specifically. Can you explain what that association meant? Richard looked at the note. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the involuntary acknowledgement of a thing he had hoped would never exist in a room like this one. His attorney leaned over and murmured something. I have no memory of that note, Richard said. You have no memory of it, Mark repeated. Were you aware that James kept notes about your joint financial arrangements? I don't know what James kept. Were you aware that James had concerns about the Meridian account in the period before his death? Douglas Farr objected. Mark rephrased. Richard's answers became shorter, the pauses between them longer. I watched him carefully. He was not unraveling exactly. He was a controlled man, but he was doing something I had never seen him do before. He was hesitating. The hesitations were small, but in a deposition, where time moves differently and every silence is part of the record, they were visible and damning. I thought of all the years I had believed him. All the years I had organized my life around a number he gave me, $42,000. While this man sat across town and watched a different number grow in a bank account he never intended me to find. What kind of person does that? What kind of person shakes your hand at a graveside and then goes home and checks a balance sheet? Because somewhere in the architecture of his 15-year deception, he had not accounted for the note. He had not accounted for Gloria Chen's statement. He had not accounted for Ruth Beckett's 217 pages. He had built his version of events assuming that I would not look carefully enough, that the grief-softened widow he had settled with decades ago was the only version of me that existed. He had miscalculated. At hour 3 of the deposition, Mark placed a bank document on the table, a signature card from the Meridian account opening, showing both James's and Richard's signatures, dated 14 months before James's death. Mr. Calloway, Mark said, you signed this account opening document. I was James's business partner. You had full signatory access. In my capacity as his partner, yes. After James's death, did you exercise this signatory access? The pause was longer this time. I watched Richard's hand on the table. His fingers moved slightly, a barely perceptible adjustment, like a man finding his footing on ice. I managed the account in the interest of the estate, he said, for 15 years. Yes, without notifying the primary beneficiary of the estate. I have already explained my reasoning. Without notifying the court. He stopped, started again. I acted in what I believed were the best interests of the money, Mr. Calloway, Mark said quietly. $19 million. Where did you believe the best interests of that money lay? Richard looked at his attorney. His attorney made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and Richard, for the first time in the 3 hours we had sat in this room, said nothing at all. I looked at him across the table. He was still Richard, the good coat, the silver hair, the practiced authority, but something behind his eyes had shifted. He knew. He had known for months, probably, that this was coming. And here it was, all of it, documented, dated, and on the record. Outside the conference room window, Chicago continued its gray indifference. Somewhere below us, people were going about ordinary lives, having ordinary Februaries. And in this room, 15 years of a carefully constructed lie had finally run out of runway. I realized, completely calm. The civil trial lasted 11 days. I was present for every one of them, sitting behind Mark at the plaintiff's table in a courtroom on the 6th floor of the Richard J. Daley Center, watching February turn to March through the tall windows. Meg came for 4 of the days. Tyler flew in from Seattle for the final 2. Having them there changed something in the quality of the air around me. I was no longer just a plaintiff, a legal abstraction, a surviving spouse. I was a mother. I was a family. And what was being argued in that room was not only about money. It was about what James had built and what his children deserved to inherit from it. Not the assets alone, but the truth. Richard's defense was built on 3 pillars. That his management of the Meridian account was a reasonable exercise of his authority as executor, that the funds represented legitimate business income properly accruing to CMC Holdings, which was a separate legal entity from the estate, and that my 15-year failure to inquire constituted a form of implied acceptance of the estate settlement. That last argument was the one that infuriated me most, and I say infuriated deliberately, because I had not allowed myself much fury throughout this process, had kept it banked and controlled. But sitting in that courtroom listening to Douglas Farr suggest that my grief was indistinguishable from consent nearly broke through every boundary I had set for myself. The notion that a woman who is too devastated to audit her husband's estate within months of his death has somehow surrendered her legal rights to the man appointed to protect them. I watched 2 members of the jury shift in their seats when that argument was made, and I understood that they felt it too. Ruth Beckett testified for 2 days. She was extraordinary on the stand, unhurried, precise, entirely impervious to Douglas Farr's attempts to complicate her methodology. She walked the jury through the deposit history, the CMC holding structure, the gap between what Richard had reported to the estate and what the account actually held. She explained, with the kind of clarity that makes numbers feel like narrative, that what had occurred was the systematic siphoning of estate assets into a privately controlled fund over a period of 15 years. She used a single phrase that I could see land differently in the jury's attention: structured concealment. Not an error, not an oversight, a structure. Built deliberately, maintained deliberately. Collapsed only because someone found a bank card in a coat. Gloria Chen testified about her time at CMC Holdings. She was composed and factual. She described the company's transition after James's death, Richard's assumption of full operational control, the profitability of the continued contracts. She had not been asked to conceal anything, she said. She had simply never been told about the Meridian account and had no reason to consider it her business. Her testimony established that the company had continued generating significant revenue under Richard's management, which directly contradicted his claim that there had been nothing to disclose. She left the stand without drama, smoothing her jacket as she walked back to her seat, and I thought, this is what courage looks like when it's quiet. I testified for 1 afternoon. I had dreaded this more than anything else in the process, not because I feared cross-examination, but because I would have to sit in a chair and say out loud in a public room the full sequence of what had been done to me: the coat, the card, the phone call, the number, the note in James's handwriting, all of it. I spoke for 2.5 hours. I spoke slowly and clearly, and I looked at the jury when I answered Mark's questions, and I looked at Douglas Farr when I answered his. When Farr asked me why I had taken 15 years to investigate, I paused for exactly the right amount of time. Because, I said, I trusted the man who told me there was nothing to find. No one in the room made a sound. Mark's closing argument was 38 minutes long, and I remembered every word of it. Mrs. Mitchell, he told the jury, did not fail to act. She did not sit on her rights. She did not knowingly accept a fraudulent settlement. She was a 37-year-old widow with 2 young children who placed her trust in the man who had been appointed by her husband and the court to manage his affairs honestly. That trust was not naive. It was appropriate. What was inappropriate, what was, in fact, a profound betrayal of both legal duty and elementary human decency, was what Richard Calloway did with it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent those 2 days at Diana's house because I could not be alone and I could not be anywhere that felt like waiting. We cooked things we didn't need to cook. We watched 2 films neither of us could afterward describe. We walked around her block in the cold on the second evening, and she linked her arm through mine and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. The verdict was in our favor on all 3 claims: fraudulent concealment, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion of assets. The judge, in his assessment of damages, awarded me the full $19 million in diverted business proceeds, plus interest accrued over 15 years, plus legal costs. The total came to $22,400,000. He also referred the matter to the Cook County District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges. Richard stood at the defense table when the verdict was read. He did not collapse or rage. He stood very still, and I saw on his face something I had never expected to see there. He looked old. Not old in the way people go gradually. Old in the way that understanding something costs you something irreversible. The particular aging of a man who has finally run out of room to maneuver. Lynn, sitting in the gallery, pressed her hand over her mouth. I sat with Meg's hand in mine and Tyler's arm around my shoulders, and I looked straight ahead. I did not look at Richard. I had spent enough of my life looking at Richard. From that moment forward, he would exist in my peripheral vision at most. In legal documents, in news items I would read once and set aside. He did not deserve the center of my attention. He never had. The Meridian account's existing balance, the portion from the original joint deposit James and Richard had made before James's death, was a more complex matter. After 3 months of additional proceedings, Mark negotiated a settlement that gave me 60% of those funds as well, on the grounds that James's estate documentation supported his intent to include them in the marital estate. When it was all finalized, I had recovered assets totaling just over $28 million. The money was real. It was mine. And I had earned it not by finding it, but by refusing to let someone else keep it. I did not quit my job immediately. This surprises people when I tell them, but the job at Northwestern had given me structure and purpose for 15 years, and I was not ready to simply shed it the morning after a verdict. I took 3 months of leave first, a long, deliberate pause, and I spent it doing almost nothing that could be called productive. I walked. I cooked. I drove to Michigan City and spent a week near the lake in a rental house with Meg and Tyler, and let myself exist in their company without an agenda. I thought about James a great deal during that time. Not the grief of him. I had done that work mostly across the long years before the coat. I thought about who he was and what he had intended. I had come to a kind of peace with the uncertainty. The note in his handwriting, Meridian, ask Richard, suggested he had been uneasy, that he'd wanted to clarify something. Whether he'd been about to confront Richard, whether he'd suspected something, I would never know for certain. I chose to believe he had been a good man caught between his love for me and his loyalty to his brother, and that he had left the card as the thread I was eventually meant to pull. That felt true enough. Some things have to be true enough. I resigned from Northwestern in June. They gave me a small party. I hugged people I had eaten lunch with for a decade and carried a box of plants and books to my car and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before driving away. I hired a fee-only financial advisor, and together we built a structure, a trust for Tyler and Meg, endowments to 2 charities James had cared about, and a living situation that was comfortable without being extravagant. Because I had lived carefully for a long time, and it had not actually made me unhappy. I moved to Wilmette, 3 miles from my old house, close enough to Meg and close enough to Deanna. It had a garden in the back that needed work, which was exactly right. I traveled. Spain in the autumn, New Zealand the following spring with Meg, Japan the year after alone, which was the best of them all. I started painting again, badly, cheerfully, without ambition, and Richard. The criminal referral resulted in charges, wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and financial exploitation of a surviving spouse. Richard was convicted on the wire fraud charge and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty. He received 4 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after 2. He was 61 years old at sentencing, standing at the defendant's table in a suit that was slightly too large, looking as though he had been somehow reduced, not just aged, but diminished. The authority quietly drained out of him. Lynn filed for divorce 6 months into his sentence. The civil judgment, combined with legal fees and the dissolution of CMC Holdings, left Richard with very little. The house in Winnetka sold in a market that was not kind to sellers who needed to sell quickly. I heard about these things through Mark, and occasionally through the social grapevine of communities like ours. I did not follow the news of Richard's sentence with satisfaction. Exactly. It was something quieter than that. A closing. A door, finally at rest. Diana came to my new house for dinner the November after everything was finalized. We sat in the garden in coats because the evening was cold, but neither of us wanted to go inside yet. She poured wine and said, "Are you happy?" I thought about it seriously. "I'm at peace," I said, "which I think is better." She nodded. She understood. Meg got engaged the following spring to a man named Patrick, who was straightforwardly kind. Tyler was promoted and bought an apartment in Capitol Hill. I visited Seattle twice a year, and each time it rained exactly as much as everyone says. The coat hung in the new house for a while. And then one morning I took it down and held it and thought of James, and the anniversary, and the day he'd pressed it on me even though I said it was too much. Then I folded it carefully into a bag for goodwill. Some things you keep, some things you carry long enough, and then you set them down.